Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I can't say how honored I am by this occasion and by all the good things said about me. I think only my mother would believe them all. And she also would say some more in addition. First, just a word, I think, to and about Harvey. I think, basically, the best way of saying it is to say what we as Muslims say when we bid farewell to the departed. We belong to God, and to Him we returned. I think we all would be lucky to have the kind of imprint and the kind of trail that Harvey left behind. So I think it's a wonderful celebration. Now, there is a character we actually, in the Arab world, he's a kind of an idiot savant. And he was full of tricks and full of wisdom at the same time. And he came to a very big audience, very distinguished audience like this one, and said, "Do you know what I'm going to speak to you tonight about?" And they said, "No." He said, "Well, then there is no use talking to you about any of this." So he came back the second time and said, "Do you know what I'm going to talk to you about?" And they all said yes. They said, "Well, then there's no need for me to talk to you about it." So then he came back the third time, and they set a trap for him. And he said, "Do you know what I'm going to talk to you about?" Half said yes, half said no. He said, "Well, those who know can tell those who don't know." And off he went. So I think that this is really probably would be the best thing to do to this kind of audience. My recommendation to speak into audiences like this is you should just come and just without any knowledge of who's there. Because if you actually know who's there, who's in the audience, your faith in yourself as a speaker recedes. There are so many distinguished people here. There are so many distinguished people who know the Arab world and the Middle East, so many great academics and thinkers that I just think it's really kind of a humbling experience to be here. Now, I have been given honors beyond my wildest dreams. John mentioned several of these honors I've received. Anyone would be enough for a career. Any one of these awards would be enough to cap a career. Now, how did I do it? I have no idea. And because, in fact, as you know, all these prizes are prizes you don't apply for. Someone gives them to you. Now, why they give them to you, it's really up to them. So I remember when I received the MacArthur Prize Award, I nearly came close to blowing it because, in fact, I mistook the late Roderick MacArthur for a prankster friend of mine and told him where to go, and he wasn't very amused. Then the Bradley Prize, which I received in 2006, was a very interesting experience. I had nominated a very, very worthy contender. So when before the awards were announced, the president of the Bradley Foundation, Michael Greeby, was looking for me, and I was very excited. Finally, he reached me, and I said, Mr. Greeby, did my nominee win? He said, "No, your nominee, he was good. We'll be looking at him in the future." So I sort of paused, and he said, "You won." Well, I dubbed myself after that the Dick Cheney of the Bradley Prize. I had willed my own prize. I don't know, again, why I'm honored with this, but I truly and humbly accept it and hope to continue doing the kind of work that brought me to your attention. Now, there is something which I found, which I'd like to share with you. It's a kind of a piece of satire that a Saudi wrote. Now, I know you will say, do Saudis have satire? They actually have a lot of satire. They're really a very creative bunch of people because they sort of, in a way, have to live in this odd environment that's Saudi Arabia. And so there is so much creativity there. The other day I saw there was a kind of, by the side of the road in Riyadh, there was a striking-looking woman, young woman, wearing a black abaya, and she was carrying a sign. And the sign said, "Cars want to be driven by Saudi women." And I said, well, that's obviously the Saudis have their work cut out for them, denying women their rights. People are really have awakened, and they have stirred to their rights and to the things they value. I found this piece of satire, I think it kind of does it it's a good introduction to this so-called Arab Spring. And it is by a Saudi, as I said. And the title of it, Almighty God, please destroy the internet and its evil children. And here's the text. Here's the text of this Saudi commentary. In the old days, the leaders of the Arab world lived happily, secure in the knowledge that their people were obedient to them. They would kill one of their subjects, and the father of the victim would come forth and say, "My Sultan, you have honored me with the killing of my son. He deserved his fate. He walked by your palace, troubled you with his odor and his worn-out clothes. Had you not killed him, I would have done it myself." Every ruler had his sword at the ready, not to liberate the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, says this man, but to kill this subject, to cut off the tongue of the other subject, to round up and imprison anyone who failed to kneel before the ruler's glory and the ruler's power. And the rulers would take for themselves what they wanted, by way of treasure, by way of beautiful women, never taking into account the people's rights and desires. On account of this, pride and dignity atrophied and died among the people. They were left with water and grass as a flock of sheep, or they would be allowed to sing and dance and recite folk poetry. But God the Almighty, the destroyer of tyrants, responded to the prayers of the meek and sent them a blessing called the internet. It laid bare hidden secrets and defied censorship. It was lucky that the internet had several children. The firstborn was a child called Facebook. It accomplished miracles. It laid to waste the sultans of Egypt and Tunisia. Then came a younger brother, Twitter, which though young, did its share to level the walls of fortified cities and to spread the reputation of Muhammad Bouazizi. Muhammad Bouazizi is probably the most important Arab in generations. He was that fruit vendor, I will say more about him, in the forlorn Tunisian town who set himself ablaze and began this Arab Spring. There was then held a conference to save the thrones of the mighty against the slave revolts. The children of the internet were now wanted, dead or alive. And the security services were put to work, and a meeting was held with the rulers. The latter thought that the matter had been settled, that the impertinent internet and its children had been rounded up or slain. And the rulers turned up, each one saying, "God, rid me of these wicked ones as you rid Obama of Osama." But a surprise lay in store for the sultans. The leader of the operation said, "My lords and masters, we can't arrest the internet, for it's like air, formless. Your only solution is the men of religion. Perhaps they could tame the internet and the wicked Facebook and Twitter." So they chose one of the most capable of the ulama meaning the religious class, the preachers. He led them in prayer and beseeched the Almighty against these new wicked creatures. He said, "Please God, freeze the blood in the veins of the internet and its children." "But it has no blood," said the head of the security services. The sheikh was given $1 million by each of the rulers. He assured them that their prayers will be answered. After prayer, the head of the security then stepped forth, and basically he broke down and said, "I bear terrible news. The internet has begotten a dangerous child, a more dangerous child still, YouTube, where every and any little person could expose the scandals of the mighty. Your only solution is an ancient advice given by a dying king to his son. 1, rule justly among the people. 2, leave alone the fortunes of others. Don't mix ruling with commerce." Every single ruler in the Arab world became a big kleptocrat and a big thief. This is really what broke the bond. The great Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was not loved in America, the Egyptian ruler who, if you will, was the seminal figure in modern Arab history, died and left his family a passbook account, which was all the money he ever accumulated. Then, of course, we saw what has happened in the Arab world of late. 3, don't manipulate religion and use it as a weapon of political power. Every one of them manipulates religion and uses it as a weapon of political power. 4, don't imprison people and torture those who render you advice. 5, respect women and grant them their rights. 6, transform prisons into public libraries. 7, let the people say what they wish, for they are your eyes on the clerks and the administrators. Finally, I advise you, this head of security said, to open the windows of your palaces so the winds of liberty would blow in. To a man, they howled in protest, and to a man, they fainted. And then the guards tried to revive them, but this head of the security forces said, let them be, leave them to their stupor. So that's what happened, if you will, in the kind of the onset as an introduction to this Arab Spring. A couple of weeks ago, I called on Secretary Shultz to brief him about, just matters Middle Eastern. Those of you who have worked with Secretary Shultz, who know George Shultz, would know it's a kind of a forbidding experience to go in and brief George Shultz. I always kind of look forward to it, and I'm always made nervous by it. So I was given a talk, and the title of my talk called "The Best Day After a Bad Emperor is the First," right? The best day after a bad emperor is the first. The subtitle, Tracking the Arab Spring. So he inquired about my title, and I said, the first part of it, the best day after a bad emperor is the first, comes from the Roman historian Tacitus. He said, I like that, that's great. Then he lit into the subtitle, and he said, you can't use the Arab Spring. He said, because spring is always followed by summer. And then there comes a dreary autumn. Then there is a ferocious winter. Bring the braziers out in Aleppo and Damascus. So he said, you have to choose another term and use another term. So what about the Arab awakening? And I thought, that's very interesting, the Arab awakening. So I said, Mr. Secretary, it's interesting you choose the Arab awakening. I'm going to adopt it. But the Arab awakening was the title of a great book written about the Arab world, the Manifesto of Arab Nationalism, by a writer called George Antonius. He wrote it in 1938, and it was published in 1939. It was one of the seminal books of modern Arab history. And anyway, I think the Arab awakening works better because this Arab Spring, in a kind of unlikely way, it broke out on December 17. So that's kind of the beginning of this upheaval, where Mohammed Bouazizi, a street vendor in a forlorn Tunisian town called Sidi Bouzaid, took his produce on his cart to the market. And he said to his family that these were the best dates and oranges and apples he'd seen in a very long time. A headstrong policewoman, it's very interesting. The gender of the police, if you will, is very interesting because he's coming into a kind of confrontation with the police. And this is Tunisia, the most modern of Arab nations, where there were actually policewomen and actually there had been a kind of modernist inheritance in Tunisia. So this headstrong policewoman, Fadi Hamdi, cut him off. She carried one load of his apples to her car. She was not taking them to steal them. She was challenging his right to sell these apples. She returned for another box. He protested. She hit him with her baton. And then here's where the controversy began. We think she slapped him across the face. There came the seminal words of Mohammed Bouazizi. Why are you doing this to me? I'm a simple man, and I just want to work. Why are you doing this to me? I'm a simple man, and I just want to work. He wet his body with paint thinner in front of the municipality and set himself ablaze. He would survive for another 3 weeks. On his deathbed, he was visited by a tacky-looking man in a shiny suit with jet black hair, the ruler, Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali. One of the main insignia of power in the Arab world is jet black hair. Anyone here who's gray, forget about it. One of the great questions about Hosni Mubarak was when he came on a gurney, you remember, brought to face the court, is Hosni Mubarak going to come with his hair dyed, or there was rumor that he let his hair gray? He couldn't. He, of course, had to dye his hair as he was brought in on a gurney. Now, the same, if you will, with Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. On January 14, bin Ali made a hasty escape to Saudi Arabia. He actually wanted to go to Paris, but Sarkozy had other ideas for French diplomacy. He didn't want this crook in Paris. On the way out, bin Ali's wife, a former hairdresser, we think actually she had a more interesting profession than that, but we'll settle for a hairdresser. A former hairdresser stopped off at the central bank for one final withdrawal for the road. 1.5 tons of gold bar worth 62 million euros. But she ends up in Saudi Arabia where she can't drive a car, so I think there is some punishment. There is some punishment to this. So now this rebellion which erupted in Tunisia had a scent, if you will, it had a scent for grief and for things that matter. This rebellion was in search of a theater worthy of its ambitions. It skipped Libya. It's interesting how these things happen. It skipped Libya, made its way eastward to Dunya. Those who know Arabic and know the Arab will know that Dunya means the mother of the world. Cairo, Al-Qahira, the name of it, the city victorious. It made its way to Cairo. On January 25, to counter a small protest, the Mubarak regime shut down the internet. On Friday, January 28, after morning prayers, came the great storm. Egypt was done with Pharaoh. It was done with Mubarak. He had become Egypt's third longest-serving ruler since Ramses II. I think that's a long time. Now, of course, he had no hope of breaking the record of Ramses II because Ramses II ruled for 69 years. So he wasn't even going to be close one way or the other. Mubarak had belittled his own people and had toyed with them. He had come to power courtesy of Anwar al-Sadat, but for 3 decades, he refused to designate a vice president. Plunder and repression had become the hallmarks of his regime. The modest Air Force officer of middle peasantry had begun to harbor dynastic ambitions for his son. For 18 days, the world watched as history unfolded in Liberation Square. Egyptians wanted their country back from the ruling gang. I read you a quote from a very dear friend of mine, a man of great distinction in Egypt, who has been something of a kind of a tutor to me. He said, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak took away my love of my country. These protesters gave it back to me. These protesters gave it back to me. On February 11, Pharaoh quit. By March 17, I chose this date carefully as a kind of a marker of 3 months after the deed of Mohammed Bouazizi. The regimes in Tunisia and Egypt had toppled, and massive revolts had broken out in Yemen, Libya, and Bahrain. Almost on cue, Syria came in at mid-March. A chant echoed through Arab lands, rhythmic, simple, with so much yearning and wrath poured into it. I'll tell it to you in Arabic. I won't be testing you at the end to see if you remember it, but it just gives you the cadence of what was playing out in the Arab world. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. It just went on. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. You could repeat it almost in your sleep. The people want to topple the regime. It was beautiful and simple because they never said what regime. In Libya, it meant the Gaddafi regime. In Syria, it meant the Assad regime. So the people want to topple the regime. That chant traveled easily. From tiny Qatar, Qatar has become a very, very important country. It used to be that Qataris woke up in the morning and said, how can we annoy Saudi Arabia today? It was like an obsession of the Qataris. Now I think Qatar, basically because of Al Jazeera, it's said that there are some countries with television channels And in the case of Al Jazeera, a clever person said, this is a television station with a country. So Al Jazeera carried this message. Al Jazeera carried the message of this rebellion. Now, Bouazizi had lit a fuse. He had laid bare the material of the Arab world. Terrible, corrupt rulers, country owners, really. They had become country owners and sullen young populations. For its part, our country, our dear and beloved country, was caught in the middle of the bleak landscape. We had the friendship of the rulers, such as it was, this friendship. I think we can talk about it, ad nauseum. So we had the friendship of the rulers and the bitter enmity of the population. As the great Bernard Lewis put it, I think he's become a resident close to you here. As the great Bernard Lewis said, we had this phenomenon of pro-American regimes and anti-American populations. And that's really was the American dilemma in this kind of Arab setting. The famed youth bulge, the fact that the Arab people had a tremendously young populations, the youngest in terms of the age structure, the age pyramid in the world. The famed youth bulge was functioning like a wrecking ball. The play varied with the setting. In both Egypt and Tunisia, the armed forces refused to fire on the people and the dictators quit. In Libya, it was the luck of the Libyans that Gaddafi said in public that his forces were on the way to Benghazi, that he would hunt down the protesters, house to house, street by street. Rats, he called his people. So he was coming down, he was coming to Benghazi to exterminate the rats. He had dubbed himself king of the kings of Africa. He had turned his back on the Arabs. And guess what? The Arab League paid him back, authorized an international effort against him. Sarkozy and Cameron and Obama came to the rescue. Obama came to the rescue reluctantly. By going to Libya, he falsified, if you will, as Leon Wieseltier put it in a recent essay, President Obama falsified his own premise because he showed the extent to which American power could deliver people from their misery. An intensive air campaign and a rebellion on the ground pushed the Gaddafi regime into its grave. The brother leader, as you have seen so dramatically, was pulled out of a drainage pipe and tormented and killed by his young captor. He came out with these remarkable words, again, forgive the Arabics, "La tutliq an-nar, la tutliq an-nar," don't shoot. Now imagine, a man had ruled for 42 years, killed tens of thousands of people, but it is "La tutliq an-nar," don't shoot. Well, they did to him worse than just don't shoot. I scandalized, I think, some CNN viewers, I believe, by saying it's too bad that such murderers as Gaddafi can only die once. Well, guess what? Charles Krauthammer wrote in the same vein. I guess those Benjamin Franklin recipients do march to the same tune. So we had this agreement. So much for Libya. Now there is one country which I think lacks the drama, but there is a problem there. Bahrain, where a Shia majority rose against the Sunni dynasty. It rose against the Sunni dynasty. But one day last March, Saudi forces drove into Bahrain. The King Fahd causeway that connected Bahrain to Saudi Arabia was put to good use. By the way, witty Saudis called Bahrain the pub at the end of the causeway. So this time, the causeway was put for different reasons than Bahrain providing entertainment for Saudis. But the fight for and over Bahrain has not been settled. Our Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. We are implicated in the doings of that regime. It's not quite Syria, of course. It's not quite Libya, but a regime that imposes prison sentences of 15 years to life on doctors and nurses for helping the protesters is clearly a regime that's not a happy one. Last summer, the daughter of the King of Saudi Arabia was given in marriage to the son of the King of Bahrain. So Saudi Arabia is committed to this order in Bahrain, and I think Bahrain will have to sort out a different social contract. The problem with Bahrain is that there is the Sunni dynasty, the Khalifa family. They came to Bahrain in the 18th century but they have retained this idea of being a conquering dynasty, and the gap between them and the majority Shia population remains acute. Now, a word about Yemen. The humorist Russell Baker once said that in every discussion of the Middle East, the question comes up, what about Yemen? And the answer is, what about Yemen? Yemen remains in play as we speak. The country now boasts the only living Arab Nobel Peace Prize winner. And not only that, a mother of three, a young woman of exemplary courage and poise. The country is the quintessential failed state. In Yemen, and I think we can call it Afghanistan, I always refer to Yemen, Afghanistan with a coastline. The ruler, Ali Abdullah Saleh, plays cat and mouse with the people in the street. He promises to quit, then he takes back his promise. This is the Arab world's poorest country, running out of water, torn by secessionist movements in the north and the south. This is the home of Al-Qaeda affiliate, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen is Saudi Arabia's nightmare. Such wretchedness, such despair, right next to the prosperity and the wealth of the Saudi state. Now, this Arab awakening met its cruelest test, I believe, in Syria. A group of young boys, aged 10 to 15, in a peripheral town called Dir'a in the south, some 8 months ago, were caught scribbling anti-regime graffiti on the walls. They were picked up and tortured. And when tribal elders and notables came for the children, the elders were snubbed and humiliated by the security forces. Forget your children, they were told. Go home and get new ones. And if you can't get new ones, we will send your way real men who will help you out. You can imagine what that meant to tribal Bedouin elders in the culture of Dir'a. Dir'a rose in rebellion. Collective punishment followed. The regime had been sure it would be spared the turmoil of the Arab lands, but it was wishful thinking. Bashar had said, I won't face any rebellion here. I'm young. The rulers of Egypt and Tunisia are old. I am a confrontation state with Israel. So all these illusions, he was to be proven wrong. The spark would catch in Banias, in Latakia on the coast, in Jisr al-Shughur, in Idlib, and in the haunted city of Hama, known for that massacre in 1982 where Assad's father, Hafiz Assad, massacred 20, 30,000. The numbers are uncertain. And Hama rose in rebellion, and in Deir az-Zur in the east, and in the country's third largest city, Homs, which would become the center of this rebellion. The geography of the rebellion tells a story. These are all Sunni Arab territories. They are or Sunni neighborhoods in mixed cities, because in fact, the rebellion did not reach the Kurdish territory in the northeast. It did not reach the Druze homeland in the south, nor, of course, did it reach the Alawi mountain, Jabal Ansariya. The sectarian schism at the heart of the struggle cannot be denied. Many Arabs, many Syrians would love to think that this is just a fight between a dictator and a kind of civil protest. It is in part that, but it's also a religious fight. The Alawis, a schism within a schism. They claim to be a Shia. The Shia occasionally claim them, occasionally don't claim them. There are 10 to 12% of the populations. For centuries, they had been despised and branded as heretics, had conquered power through the Ba'ath Party and the military. A proud Sunni country with deep roots in Islamic history, had been subdued by sectarians. The mountains had conquered the cities of the plains. For centuries in Syria, power had been exercised from Damascus, Homs, and Hama, and Aleppo in the north, the four principal cities. The Alawis had pulled off a historic heist of monumental proportions. They ruled, but they could not reconcile the Sunnis to their dominion. The Assads, in power for the last 4 decades, had become a ruling dynasty. Let them eat anti-Zionism, this regime cynically thought of the young and the disenfranchised. In the course of this recent history, Syrians, of course, had grown poorer. They had one of the highest birth rates in the region. A kleptocracy had risen here. Assad Sr. had been an officer who received the officer's salary and 2 cartons of cigarettes every month. The people who inherited his power, his children, and the children of his wife, and the relatives of his wife, had become enormously wealthy. They now dispose of wealth beyond imagination. Billions of dollars from monopolies, from Arab aid, from oil sales, from drug running, from money laundering. The Syrian society, meanwhile, cowered in fear. Hafiz Assad had bequeathed power to his son and given him 17 security services that kept the peace of this unhappy land. Now, once the Syrians shook off their fear, they were in no mood for compromise. They had reached the point of no return, the point at which they understood that if they call off this rebellion, the regime will find them and will hunt them down. So I think in Syria what you have is a kind of irresistible force has clashed with an immovable object, and the stakes are high, enormously high for both the regime and for the people who rebelled against it. All legitimacy now has been stripped away from this regime. The breaking point came for Bashar al-Assad when the body of a 13-year-old boy, Hamza al-Khatib, was returned to his family a month after he had been picked up in Dar'a. His body was mutilated, cigarette burns, his neck and knees were broken, his genitals were cut off. All the good Dr. Bashar could then say and speak to his people, he resembled his people, he spoke of them as germs. It was, again, he is medically trained. He's an eye doctor. And this was his contribution, if you will, to the debate. The Syrian people in their darkest hour, they hadn't really lost their sense of humor. And there was a placard I saw, which I liked, that said, "The Syrian germs require a new doctor." Another one, "The Syrian germs salute the Libyan rats." So again, there was still some levity in the midst of this incredible tragedy. 8 months on, the Syrians are gripped by what I call a case of Libya envy. But no one is riding to the rescue of the Syrians. Ma'an Allah, God is with us, was the name the Syrian protesters gave to one of their Fridays. The regime is aided by its sensitive borders. Look at these borders of Syria. Lebanon on one side, Israel on the other, Jordan yet again, Iraq is another border, Turkey is one border again of great consequence. As a Gulf diplomat said, what can we do about Syria? You set a firecracker there in that neighborhood and there is trouble. And the Syrian regime was also aided at the United Nations by the double veto of Russia and China, and to their eternal disgrace, I think, and discredit, the participation against the Syrian people in the United Nations Security Council last month by India, Brazil, and South Africa. Now, the regime's Achilles heel, if you will, is money. It's spending and burning through $1 billion a month. It has kept Aleppo and Damascus, the largest 2 cities in the country, quiet by a mix of co-optation of the merchant class and a heavy dose of terror. But how long can this last? We don't really know. Even the Shabiha, this is a name for the dreaded vigilantes who do the killings of Bashar al-Assad, even the Shabiha have to be paid. Some days ago, the Arab League, I think, surprised itself. It suspended Syria's membership in that body. It gave impetus to the rebellion. Virtually the entire Arab League voted against the Syrian regime. Lebanon, which is a Syrian protectorate, had to go with the Syrians, and everybody understood that you have to cut the Lebanese slack. Iraq abstained, and I think it tells us something about the kind of regime that Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq appears to be, I think, now heading. This, I have sketched these different 6 countries, I think, and now just a couple of, some thoughts about this Arab Spring or George Shultz's Arab Awakening. Can this Arab Awakening end badly? Of course it can. These are prison riots, and the prisoners don't have the skills and the institutions to see them through. A good deal of the fate of the Arab Awakening will depend on Egypt. 25% of the population of the Arab world are Egyptian. Egypt is a trendsetter in Arab political and cultural life. There are worries in Egypt about lawlessness, about unrealistic expectations, and unbounded claims. There are demands for retribution and justice for the 800 people who were killed in the rebellion against Mubarak. A decent man, Issam Sharaf, the prime minister of the country, anointed by Liberation Square and by the protesters, has the responsibility but no effective power. Behind the curtain is the great Oz, Field Marshal Tantawi, the head of the armed forces, and 23 companions, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. I get somewhat nervous when anyone uses the word supreme, other than our Supreme Court. That's a very different story. So these Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, they have the power but are invisible to the public. The economy is in trouble. Tourism has ground to a halt. A country of some 80 million people or so has run down its foreign currency reserves from something like $30 billion some months ago to $19 billion today. Egypt is the #1 importer of wheat in the world. The Egyptians will have to be fed. And populism is amok. The IMF offered Egypt something like $3 billion of loans at 1.5% interest. The Egyptians want to finance the debt locally at 13% because of the pride and because of the populism. So all is not well in Egypt. You will be told that there is anti-Coptic violence in Egypt and it's on the rise. Last month, more than 20 people perished, all Copts, set upon by the army and the goons. But that's not new in Egypt. There were 167 anti-Coptic episodes of violence since 1972. The Copts can't build or repair churches. You can get a license to build a mosque in several days. It takes 5 years to get a license for a new church if you can get one. And if you can get a license, that church can have no steeples. It can have no crosses. It can have no church bells. So again, the question of the Copts, some 8 to 10 million people, 8 to 10 million Egyptians, remains a very, very urgent question in Egypt. The military regime and the dictatorship had not really defended the Copts. We should not shed tears for Mubarak that he was much better than this period of transition. On New Year's Eve, the Church of St. Peter and St. Mark in Alexandria was attacked by arsonists, and more than 20 people perished in that attack. Mubarak did not give a damn. The troubles of Egypt notwithstanding, it has to be said that if there is one place where the ideology of Al-Qaeda was overwhelmed, it must be in Liberation Square. Politics was no longer the terrible choice between Hosni Mubarak and Ayman Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, an Egyptian aristocrat, a physician of the highest family, if you will, the most aristocratic claims in Egypt. A civic opposition had risen in Egypt. Wa'il Ghnaim, a young Google executive, became a face of this new decent opposition. Now, something decent, I think, and something important happened in Egypt on August 3rd with 3 words, again in Arabic, Afandum ana mawgood, Sir, I am present. This was Hosni Mubarak answering the judge at the court. This was Pharaoh being held to account by his people. A new phenomenon in Arab history, that rulers are being tried and they are being given their day in court. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my case about this Arab awakening is simple in many ways. The Arabs have been troubled and a source of trouble for others. It was Arab jihadists and Arab money and the prestige in South Asia of holy warriors speaking Arabic, the language of the Quran, who plunged us into Afghanistan, into an endless war, our longest ever. So we may be in Afghanistan, but it really was the Arabs who sent us into Afghanistan because from Afghanistan, they had brought death and ruin onto American soil and plunged us into this war. And this war, I think we can say of this war in Afghanistan, it's a war that really cannot be won. It's a war that has been hailed and described by our commander-in-chief as the good war of necessity. But that was only just a way of bludgeoning the Iraq war as the bad war of choice. So we are in Afghanistan, but we are in Afghanistan because of the pathology of Arab political life. Arabs are now claiming responsibility for their own history. The drums of anti-Americanism have ceased for a moment. In Hama, they threw roses and olive branches at our amazing and courageous Ambassador Robert Ford when he visited that embattled city. Not tomatoes, not eggs, not bullets, but they threw at him flowers and roses and olive branches. The homicide bombers and the martyrs have been joined by a new breed of young people and a new kind of politics, civil protest. Now, these are Arab revolutions. They met the Obama test. At one point, President Obama said he will only help these rebellions if they're organic. So I call that the Whole Foods test. And these revolutions, the arugula test, you will remember President Obama once was wondering about the price of arugula at Whole Food. So these were organic revolutions to the Arab world. We did not make these revolts, nor could we stop them. We should dispense with what George W. Bush, whom I shall always think of as a great and very, very seminal president. Well, he gave me the National Medal of the Humanity. I'm all sold on him. We should dispense with what Bush called the soft bigotry of low expectations. We should trust people with their liberty. Ronald Reagan and his first mate, George Shultz, made such a bet on the captive nation. Reagan wasn't paralyzed by the pretext that post-communism would have to be messy. Post-communism was messy, but he left that argument to Brent Scowcroft and Bush Sr. That history was messy, but it was noble history. This affectation today, there's a kind of affectation of worldliness in the face of this Arab Spring, in the face of this Arab awakening, in my opinion, is not worthy of a great nation that's the preeminent democratic nation in the world. This is the Arabs' 1989. This is the Arabs' 1989. Their awakening is motivated by the shame that they had applauded the despots, chanted their names, turned them into deity. These are revolts of penance. People were apologizing for the way they had treated. They had made these dictators. Dictatorship carries with it a kind of measure of consent. So this awakening is driven by the Arabs, by the knowledge that the Arabs had given up their freedom in return for bread and ended up with neither. They ended up with serfdom, as Frederick Hayek and Milton Friedman would have told them long ago. They traded their freedom for bread, and they found themselves at this point of their history with poverty, pauperization, and the absence of freedom. The possibility of failure is present in all human endeavors. After a brief moment of brilliance, when the Arabs and their new religion, Islam, spilled out of the Arabian Peninsula to overrun the Byzantine and Persian empires, to cross the Straits of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula, the Arabs, after that, knew mostly failure. I can't tell you that this awakening will succeed, but I'll be damned if I sit in early and hasty judgment on these rebellions. Who would have it in them to yearn for Gaddafi? Who would want renewed servitude for the Syrian people? Who would want to grieve for Mubarak? These terrible men and their fellow despots, they begot the history they deserved. The closest historical analogy, by the way, to this storm that broke upon the Arab are the revolutions of 1848, the springtime of people in Europe. That revolution had erupted in France, then hit the Italian city-state and the German principalities, reached the remote outposts of the Austrian empires. There must have been 50 of these revolts. An aristocrat from Piedmont, Massimo Desilio, penned what for me remain the most arresting words about liberty's appeal and liberty's risks. Quote, this is from this Piedmontese aristocrat: "The gift of liberty is like that of a horse, handsome, strong, high-spirited. In some, it arouses a wish to ride. In many others, on the contrary, it increases the urge to walk. For some, it arouses the wish to ride. in many others on the contrary, it increases the urge to walk. For several decades, the Arabs walked and cowered in fear. Now they're eager to take freedom's ride. Luckily for them, they're paying no heed to those who are warning them of liberty's risks. Now, one note, which is final note, I think, I don't know, maybe I've taken more of your time than I should have. Some years ago, I don't know if you know Michael Ignatieff. Some of you will recognize him. He's now active in Canadian politics, a very noted intellectual. And he was a journalist. He had a very distinguished career. And he asked me, he wanted to do a profile of me for some television program that he was host of. I usually don't accept profiles. I call them racial profiling, you know. It's like, why do you have this politics when you were born in the Arab world? And he said, like, okay, you know, it's not very interesting. So Michael Ignatieff sought me out, and in a moment of weakness, because it was Michael Ignatieff, I was flattered by the invitation and thought I would submit to this interview, to this profile. Ignatieff came prepared, and the first question he asked me right away was, he said, so what's your response to the charge that you are a traitor to the Arabs? I thought that was a little strong, you know. But, you know, I had something to say to that charge of treason or charge of betrayal, because I never really thought I betrayed anything, you know. I lived on this seam, on the fault line between America and the Arab world. And I believed I was loyal to both these homes. The original home from which I came, this small country called Lebanon, and this great open country that had, you know, accepted me and made room for me. So I had this kind of words committed to memory. They came from Joseph Conrad, who was the first writer I was introduced to in Lebanon. You know, I learned English by reading Joseph Conrad and Dickens and Shakespeare, but you can imagine the shock that greeted me in America. You know, like, I work for, you know, it's not relevant, but I work in a cannery once, and my boss, who came from Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, a remarkable guy, you know, he was like, I had no idea what he was saying most of the time. He wanted to scare me. He said, yesterday I canned 2 cats. So I thought, wow, this guy is incredible. We were working in a cannery, so he canned 2 cats. Well, you know what I mean. He fired 2 guys. I had nothing that I had studied in Beirut had prepared me for that. And then another time he told me that he was very unhappy with me, and as a result of that unhappiness, I was going to be working the graveyard shift. I was terrified. And then, of course, I never managed to understand what chicken fried steak was. I still haven't. At any rate, so I just, I loop this, I'll circle this for you. So I said to Mr. Ignatieff, I said, well, I just remembered these words that Conrad had written, and they were a response to the charge by the Polish exiles in London that Conrad had betrayed Poland, because you know Conrad's story, that he was the son of a Polish aristocrat, and he left Poland at age 17 as a man, he said, walks into a dream and leaves the place. And so Conrad had written something. He said, it would betray, that's a big word. He said, what does a man betray? So I just thought, well, the answer to this charge of betrayal was the following. It would take too long, said Conrad, to explain the intimate alliance of contradictions that makes love itself wear at times the desperate shape of betrayal. It would take too long to explain the intimate alliance of contradictions that makes love itself wear at times the desperate shape of betrayal. So I think many of us, you know, have this enormous sympathy for the Arab world and its torments. And I think as we see, as someone like me, who was a child of Lebanon, who saw these despots, who saw these dictators and witnessed what they'd done to these societies, you know, one really kind of must give this uncertain rebellion, incoherent at times, it must be given all the support that we can offer it. As free people, I think we owe it no less. Well, thank you very much for that.
Would you like to leave your notes?
Go ahead. I trust you.
So it is clear that you all share our deep appreciation as we thank Fouad Ajami for his wide-ranging, intriguing, and evocative remarks. And so, friends, we do come to a close of another remarkable evening to share in some of the critical issues which none of us dare to neglect. In that regard, I would like to thank all of you again for joining us. Most especially, I truly encourage you to become an FPRI member if you're not already a member, or if you perhaps are at one level, consider how much more your added support, but especially your turning out for our various programs can contribute to the whole mission that Harvey and others have left us as a great tradition. So do please pick up a packet as you leave. It's out in the foyer as you depart. But before you do so, perhaps we might just share together in a moment a closing part. I would then like to share with you just a few reflections of contemporaries of Benjamin Franklin, whom we also honor each year. These are reflections that come to us from 230 years ago and also have a resonance in what we have heard tonight about the spirit of liberty. John Adams said, "Children, and presumably all citizens, should be educated and instructed in liberty." Patrick Henry said, "The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, to the active, and to the brave." Thomas Jefferson said, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." Also attributed to some by Jefferson, but later advanced by Ida Wells, is this timeless call which states, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." And lastly, we again have from our own Benjamin Franklin his astute reminder that only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more needs of masters. With these reminders lingering in our minds, we close, therefore, by wishing all of you Godspeed as you go to your own callings and what you do on behalf of this extraordinary and remarkable country, a country which calls us not to be receivers, but to be givers and expanders of the opportunities that we have of being in a country which calls us to be outreaching to others. So good evening. We ask that you all join us again here next year, and please be well. Thank you.
It's beautiful. It's very beautiful.